officers is a given, but the one decision we have is whether at this moment in time we do move this plan to referendum. And I think a number of members have indicated that, you know, even they can see that that's not the appropriate stage at this move at this stage. And I don't think that has anything to do with the manner in which we continue to cooperate and work with Headcorn in developing this plan, a new stage of the plan, whatever is necessary. And I think the officers already indicated that post our decision tonight there is willingness to do that. So it's simply tonight whether we move the plan to referendum or not. Okay, Councillor English, if it's a very quick point, because otherwise I'll stick to the strict speaking order.
I think the committee are being asked by the local councillors and the parish council to potentially consider adding a fourth recommendation, because it is quite clear that the decision not to move the plan to referendum is probably okay as it stands, but it begs the question, then what? And there would need, in my opinion, to either to be a discussion about whether there is a fourth recommendation and what that fourth recommendation would be. And some of us would think there shouldn't be, some of us would think there should be, but clearly that is where the debate is going to focus, surely.
That, in the simplest terms, I do not think is the question posed to us tonight, but we may wish to add an outline of a way forwards.
Yeah, and that very clearly is what the parish council and Councillor Prendergast had started to, and Councillor Perry started to say. So whether or not that's the recommendation officers have placed before us, it does seem to me that the debate for this committee is very clearly on whether there should or should not be a fourth recommendation.
Okay, I think that predetermines what our decision actually is going to be on point 3. Let's be clear on that and then consider a way forwards. I'll return to the speaking order. Councillor Mrs Prendergast, you are mid-flow. Would you like to continue? Okay, in which case I'll move to Councillor Wigandon first. We'll move in an order.
In looking at all this, the thing that's concerning me is everywhere the report is saying it's all too fundamental, we can't look at it, it can't be changed, there's nothing else we can do. And I find that quite difficult to accept, to be honest. An awful lot of work has gone into this, and at the end of the day, the actual basis, the actual evidence base for all of this is not going to change. So what we are talking about is a rewriting of some of it. The actual evidence that the whole thing is based on isn't going to change. So we would be talking about a rewriting of part of it. With that in mind, the suggestion that there's nothing that can be done, it's finished here, and actually it's not worth looking at it and seeing what we can do about it. I find that very difficult to accept as a way forward. It certainly isn't in the interest of working together and cooperatively, working with our parishes. Our parishes put in a lot of time for this, and for us to say, actually, you've put in a lot of work, but where we're coming from at the moment, I think we're at the end of it. I don't think that's right. At the point we are at, I think we should make the extra effort to see if we can sort this out and move it forward.
Councillor Mrs Springett.
Thank you. I agree with what Councillor de Wigandine says. I just think this is really sad. There's a huge amount of effort. They got a huge amount of involvement from their residents, and this is just like a kick in the teeth. And I just think if this is rejected and they have to go back to square one, I think the residents will just say, well, stuff that, I'm not bothering next time, because we all got involved last time and look what happened. So I just think this is This is a horrible situation. I really don't want to see it go back. I'm just curious, out of interest, what happens if we were to buck the trend and send it to referendum? I'm not saying we're going to. Out of it, what does that mean? And what would happen? Does the world end? Does it go into a holding pattern and never come out? I'm just curious as to actually what would happen if we did.
Councillor, I'm just seeing who would be best placed to make an answer. Mrs. Parks.
Yes, so the regulations as they are at present, including the new Neighbourhood Planning Act, which you've just been briefed on in the previous report, give weight to the neighbourhood plan post-examination as a material consideration in planning. And so after the referendum, if a decision has been made that the plan will be made, then the plan carries significant weight. That, of course, relies on then a decision of the full council to make that plan. And, of course, that would be a report to this committee from an officer seeking a recommendation of this committee to full council to make the plan. However, officers have put the report in front of you this evening based on the legal advice we've received, and the views of the officers currently is that the plan is not fit to take forward. So it would put us in quite a difficult position in terms of how we then move that forward. If it did come through and it came back to the committee and this committee recommended it went on to full council, it would then be down to the full council to make that decision. So you would be reliant on a majority vote at full council.
And if full council then voted to adopt it, then what happens? Out of curiosity, so full council then for some reason then votes to adopt it. So we've now got a plan that's been adopted, but technically the inspector wasn't happy with. Is it legally valid, or what happened? I'm sorry, I'm not being funny. I don't quite understand the process, and I'm a bit curious.
Yes, so when the council made a decision to make the plan, it would become part of the development plan. We would publicise it as such, but I would suggest there would very likely be a judicial review of the decision of this committee and or of full council by the likes of Gladman's, who objected at the Reg 16 stage and at the hearing.
Pause you there. Let me attempt to say what I understand the implications will be. My understanding is the latest plan to be adopted becomes the trump card. So this would trump our existing borough-wide plan, and until such time as another plan, presumably our draft local plan, then trumps that, and then the Headcourt neighbourhood plan would then cease to be extant, because the latest plan adopted becomes the trump card. That's my understanding of it. And I'll turn to officers to see whether that is correct or otherwise.
Yeah, it depends on the scenario. Dare I say it, in a year's time, if a planning application was refused, and the main reason for refusal was that it was not in accordance with the made Headcourt neighbourhood plan, then that inspector would have to give weight to what the examiner has said on page 56 of your papers. I don't, to some degree it will depend on the inspector, but I suspect that the difficulty is that our local plan, if it is adopted, would obviously be in accordance with the NPPF, something that any planning inspector has to look at, as well as the local planning context. And obviously my argument would be that our local plan is in accordance with the NPPF, otherwise you know, the inspector's not going to agree to it. But rightly or wrongly, Jeremy Edge has clearly said in his first bullet point that the Headcorn neighbourhood plan at this point in time does not have appropriate regard to national planning policy.
Yes, indeed.
It's actually sort of on another point. There's various discussions here about the cap on the size of developments. But if I'm right, there's quite a few quite big developments going on in advance of this neighbourhood plan. So it just seems rather frustrating that Headcorn has had a load of planning applications for a lot of houses approved before their neighbourhood plan, and they couldn't put them in it. Had those applications not come forward, they could have allocated those sites, with or without a cap. I'm not going into the cap, but they could have allocated those sites, and then their plan probably would have been in conformity. But because the developments happened ahead of it, it just seems to me a bit... They've got a lot of houses going there, but they can't reflect that in the neighbourhood plan because they can't denote land that was given permission 6 months ago. I'm sorry, I just think it's a sad situation.
I think that's exactly the same position we find ourselves in as a council. It's only because our local plan is putting us back into control and we have a 5-year land supply that we can actually begin to direct where development should be. And we're out of the opportunistic period. It's exactly the same principle, isn't it?
It is, but houses built 2 years ago count as part of our housing supply in 2011 to 2031. But the houses built now aren't counting in their neighbourhood plan allocation. Unless I'm misunderstanding the process. We can account for houses being built last year in our 2011 to 2031 figures, but they can't. They can't say, well, that site's included, it's being built at the moment, that's included.
Mr. Jarman, perhaps.
But the idea is that it should be the same structure. The local plan sets out an objectively assessed need in accordance with the NPPF. Is that golden thread? And as Councillor Perry said, with the Staplehurst neighbourhood plan, I think it's very good in terms of urban design principles, but it's following the structure, the broad structure, of the local plan in terms of objectively assessed need for housing.
But have their sites been built out yet and approved yet? It is a timing thing. This is what I don't get. If the developers go in and build everything before you can get your neighbourhood plan down, you're shafted because you've got all the houses and you're still supposed to allocate more.
As the chairman alluded to, and as you said, Councillor Springett, in terms of supply, which started, as you quite rightly said, in 2011, and it goes up to 2031, they are counted. They are within that 20-year trajectory. Yeah, they are for any part of the borough of Maidstone. If you're moving on sort of like to the future, if there's, you know, to be straightforward about it, if wherever a certain parish isn't taking the quantum of housing growth as set out in the Maidstone Emerging Local Plan, then obviously it's going to have to go somewhere else, wherever that is, because we've still got to make up that total supply.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, sorry. When we went to council on this, because it was done because of the Mr. Buxton, because of the Buxton letter, we sent the draft report, we sent the inspector's report, and we asked the council to give their view on it, right? The other thing, so the assessment which has been given has been, I don't want to say is independent, because they'll say, oh, of course, you instructed your own council to do that, but we had someone outside of the council look at this. And the other thing you need to bear in mind is if you look at page 51 at paragraph 3.2, It says other policies not specifically referred to in this report would need revision in order that they might be acceptable for development management purposes to meet the basic conditions test, or in the alternative deleted. So what they're saying is we've looked at this is at page 51, paragraph 3.2. Very last sentence, other policies not specifically. So, yeah, we've looked at it, or Council has looked at it. They said it doesn't meet the basic conditions, right? And I haven't had a look at all the other policies as well. I've looked at all the other policies, and there are other policies. But because of these flaws, these fatal flaws, as the examiner sees it, there are other policies, and I don't think he's identified what those other policies are, because they're not in his report, but there are other policies. This is part of the problem, it's kind of like, we're not talking about minor modifications, he's saying the whole thing needs a revision.
Councillor Mumford.
I'm not sure after that explanation where that leaves me. I, more than other people, know the struggle of trying to get a neighbourhood plan through, the expense, and I agree with Councillor English. We can't look at number 3 until we've looked at number 4, which is not on there. I believe number 3 on the recommendations is minus where it's going to end up. It's going to end up at Regulation 14, and I think members need to know what Regulation 14 is and where we're sending it back to, so we can judge the recommendation at 3. And is it necessary to send it all the way back to 14, and is there any remedial work before I can vote on 3? So I would ask the officers, what is Regulation 14? What is in front of Regulation 14 if we are sending it back there?
May I say something at that stage? So my logic slightly earlier for not commenting too closely at this stage on what the next step is so that it's not restricted in any way. And actually time can be taken to see, is it 14, is it 16, what is the best way forward? If we're very prescriptive in what we say at this stage, and I'm also minded, this is not our plan. Of course we must cooperate with the development of the plan, but it's not ours to say, you must do this, you must do that. All we have is an obligation to consider the inspector's findings, to consider the officer's advice, and then draw our own conclusion of, at this stage, does it go to referendum or not? That's where I'm at. I believe by indication, Councillor English, you're probably the next speaker.
The one thing it clearly cannot do is go to referendum. There may be a number of other things that could be done, and we need to discuss that. But it's quite clear that if it goes to referendum and were to pass, but it actually leaves a very difficult situation, because although in theory the council could refuse to make that plan, it would be very difficult if there was a positive referendum vote to actually do that. It is at this stage of the process that fundamental questions about not soundness but meeting the basic conditions should be addressed. And it would be a total failing of this council to allow the issue to go forward, because it would lead to a fundamental disconnect between 2 stages of the development plan, which could only be resolved, as has been said, by appeal, and planning policy by appeal is even less satisfactory than planning application determination by appeal. It would be entirely a lottery as to whether or not we got a sympathetic or hardline inspector, or it could even be called in by the Secretary of State, as a recent situation we've seen with Fant Farm. So it would be totally imponderable. It would be difficult. Having said that, that does not mean there is nothing we can do, and we do need to explore alternatives. The reason I say there does need to be a fourth recommendation, I'm not trying to be prescriptive, but clearly, and I have made this point many times, committee decisions have to be clear and have to be given indication of travel to the officers and to the members of this council as to what we're doing. If we simply approve the 3 recommendations as they stood, that just means we're not going to referendum. It doesn't indicate any further direction of travel, however broad. Now, I think we do need to explore what may or may not be possible, but let's not fool ourselves. It will be very difficult to retrace our steps jointly with Headcorn Parish Council to retrieve this situation. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be very difficult. In a way, it was sad that previous people in Cabinet posts, and I'm not referring to you, Councillor Burton, or to Mr Perry, did not bring forward neighbourhood plans very quickly. In fact, did everything they could to obstruct them. But that's where, so 2 years were lost, which affected Headcorn, Coxheath, Sutton Valence, Stapehurst, North Lewis, everyone. But we are where we are, and on this particular application, we do have to recognise that there are fundamental issues of principle. And I'm not saying who's right or wrong, but there is a huge gap between what's been done, not in terms of the research. The research is very good and very sound and it certainly shouldn't be lost. But there's a huge gap and perception between what Headcorn have done and the normal approach. I'm not saying it's the normal approach, it's the right approach, but the usual approach, shall I say, in producing a neighbourhood plan. And at least it appears there is a national debate about whether neighbourhood plans have to be in conformity with the current local plan or the emerging one, and there's an issue about that. But they have to be in conformity with one or the other, and it's clearly the approach taken by Headcorn is different than the borough plan that we've adopted, 2000 plan and the emerging plan, and it is different in many ways from national planning policy guidance and the framework. So there was a lot of work to do, but we possibly should be doing that work, but it won't be quick, and any people who think that that's an easy fix and we go are wrong. It's going to be hard work, but perhaps we should, in the spirit of attempting to move forward, try and find out how we do that, and I think that's what we should be discussing rather than who did what wrong and threats of judicial review on all sides. So if perhaps we can explore what is and is not possible and what stage to move this forward somehow.
Are you intending that we explore that now, or that our decision would be to explore it after tonight?
I think it would be difficult to sit down, as you said, Mr Chairman, to be prescriptive tonight and say this is the route that we have to adopt. I think that would be difficult. There is a risk we get that wrong. We close off avenues that might be profitable to explore. I'm not saying they will be, but they might be. I think we need to sit down and see what is possible and what is not possible. And I don't really think that the open forum of a committee meeting with the pressure of time is really the best way of doing that. So I think a recommendation that enables you, your Vice Chairman, and the relevant officers to sit down with the Parish Council and the ward members, obviously, and see what can and cannot be achieved is probably what we should be doing.
That makes a lot of sense. Councillor Cox, you were indicating, but I think perhaps the point is covered. So that sounded like the makings of a resolution, and I think it's possibly not two separate pieces, but it's an all-in-one, along the lines of that we do not move the plan to referendum at this but that we continue to work with Headcorn to review ways of progressing the plan in the future.
I think
Something like that, yeah?
I think the specific involvement of yourself, the Vice Chairman, the ward members needs to be recorded when this, I think it...
Right. Okay, but we can build that into it. Councillor Mrs Prendergast, you've indicated.
Only just to reiterate what Councillor English has said and what you've just covered as well. He really took the words out of my mouth. But I think there is a way that we can find some resolve and some goodwill amongst us, between us, to try and seek a resolution to this. There's too much that's gone into it on all sides. So let's look for a way forward. And, you know, talking about direction of travel, and I know you've said it's not our plan, but I really don't think, knowing the community as I do and knowing the neighbourhood group as I do, that you will find any objection from them if we are resolute in finding a way out of this. So, yeah, let's go. Let's
working
do that.
with them to find a way forwards. Councillor Mumford, are you wanting to go again?
Yeah, very quickly. I can't take the responsibility of just palming this off and it not coming back. So I personally would like to know what the way forward is. So I would like to ask that that's amended, that it comes back to this committee.
It's a necessary feature of the process that it does at set points always come back, but there's nothing to stop us having an update on progress post this meeting, which Vice Chairman would, I'm sure, support adding that to the work programme, the agenda accordingly. Okay, Councillor Willis.
I think it's an excellent idea, but could within that it be noted what the cost to Maidstone Borough Council of doing that, if any, is within that? So when it comes back to the committee, we know what officer time it would take to do that. We're skint, aren't we? So we haven't got a money tree.
No, wait. I don't think this
I agree with the essence, but I just think it's important we know.
I don't think this is about money. We're of course conscious about how much money we have, but this is not about money. In actual fact, by not progressing to referendum at this time, we cannot recover our costs to date. They're the Maidstone costs of the examination, so on. So, you know, this isn't about money; it's about getting it right. Well, yes, a successful referendum actually does, but let's try and tie this up and be very clear. So, may I venture to suggest that the wording of the motion that we'll consider is that the committee agrees not to move the plan to referendum, full stop. However, we instruct officers in collaboration with the Chair and Vice Chair to continue to work with Headcorn to find a way forwards with the neighbourhood plan.
And the two ward members.
Right, and local members, so add that in there. And add that further updates on progress be reported back to the committee. Yes? So I move that from the Chair. I think Councillor Mrs Prendergast was quick to second. May I take that to the vote? Those in favour?
With all due respect, Mr Chairman, I proposed it.
Well, I amended it and put the detail in there. So, on this occasion, Chair, right, so, the point, but was that clear, officers, on the voting there, because that was interrupted? Those in favour, please indicate again. And I believe that is unanimous. Thank you, members. Thank you, members from Headcorn. I think we're next at agenda item 16. This is the report on the fourth quarter budget monitoring, and Mr Green, you'll introduce this to us.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. This report sets out the financial position as at the end of the fourth quarter, which is the end of the financial year 16-17. the services within your committee's remit. The figures are still subject to audit, and there's one adjustment that I just need to describe, but it broadly describes the outturn for the year 16-17. And the good news for the year as a whole is that there's been an underspend of 246,631, and across the council as a whole there's also been a small underspend for 16-17. And although this is very satisfactory, it hasn't been plain sailing getting to this point. We were projecting an overspend for much of the year, but in the end, been underspends that have offset that. And in the areas that you're responsible for, you can see the overs and unders, the overspends and underspends in the table on page 65, which runs on to page 66, and the details in the appendix on page 69. And broadly speaking, for your committee, there have been overspends on planning services, but these have been more than cancelled out by additional income from parking services. The biggest area of overspend was in development management, where additional staffing costs meant that there was an overspend of 249,000 for the year. But most of this actually fell in the first 6 months of the year, and the position's now been broadly brought back under control, I'm pleased to say. Parking, as I've said, performed very well. There's a missing word "not" in the narrative under pay and display car parks, where it should say that the positive variance of 376,000 does not include the shortfall on Moat Park. And Moat Park performed below budget in 16-17, but we do expect to do better in 17-18. Charges have gone up, and the car park in Moat Park is getting really heavy use at the moment. Just a couple of other things to mention. The report doesn't talk about development control appeals, but I would like to mention those. We've had a look at the appeals that were determined in 16-17, and there are a further 120,000 or so of costs in the pipeline. And of course, that's before taking into account potential costs in relation to pending appeals. We've just got a budget for planning appeals in 16-17 and also in 17-18 of 119,000, and this isn't likely to be sufficient in 17-18, so we do have a pressure building up in this area. Another issue that I want to mention is that you may remember that the previous government signalled that it would allow authorities to increase planning fees by 20%, which for Maidstone, based on past track record, would have meant an extra 120,000 of income in 17-18, which would have helped to offset some of the pressures. Unfortunately, the legislation to allow us to implement those planning increases didn't go through before the general election. Now, given that we've got a new government of a similar political complexion to the old one, we'd obviously hope that that legislation will now go through, but it'll be delayed, and I think probably the earliest we can expect to put up planning fees will be the autumn. So that means the 120,000 that we were hoping for will be probably considerably less. So, basically, to sum up, a very satisfactory outcome for 16-17, but I do want to flag up those potential pressures in relation to 17-18, both to do with planning appeals and a delay in achieving the income from planning fee increases. And the recommendation in front of you this evening is to note the financial position for services within your remit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Councillor Willis, are you the only one indicating at the moment? Is there anyone else? Councillor de Wigenden.
I'd just briefly like to mention, the very favourable outcome we're getting on parking services, which is all very welcome. And what the concern that I have, and I know that I'm not alone in this, is that regularly we come back to a position every year where apparently we have too many parking spaces and people want to build on them. And the fact is that if we didn't actually have these parking, this parking income here, would be in a lot worse position than we are today. And I just want to register how irritated I am that every year it still keeps coming back that we have too many car parking spaces and we want to get rid of them so we can build on them.
I'll have a little go if you don't mind. Then I'll come over to my right. I do have a little bit of a problem with the way this is presented. I look at para 1.2, overall and underspend. I really don't think anything could be further from the truth, because I think the fact that an income stream has performed incredibly well potentially disguises the fact that we've essentially got planning services of one variety or another either massively overspending or significantly underfunded. And I just think that we're conflating two sets of numbers and patting ourselves on the back. I think satisfactory outcome, very satisfactory outcome was the phrase, but we've got two very different things going on. Mr. Green, can I also just ask a quick question? On the summary page on 69, the far left, well, the second left column, final adjusted estimate. So that's not the budget as full council necessarily saw it originally. And could you just elaborate on what changes may or may not have taken place there? Because that's what we're comparing to, and it may be not what we originally expected to see.
That column, final adjusted estimate, is the budget to all intents and purposes. The reason it's described as the adjusted estimate is that we do have a procedure under our constitution whereby we can move budgets from one heading to another. So, for example, if we were to move staff from, I'm just giving an example, I'm not saying it happened, from development management to planning policy, we would shift money between budgets, and those are the adjustments that are alluded to here. We still have to balance the position for the committee, and also if we're proposing a environment like this of more than 50,000, we would have to come and get your approval. So, Councillor Burton, I don't think you need to be concerned. Effectively, this is the budget that's described under final adjusted estimate, so it's fair to compare the figure in column A with the figure in column B when we're looking at the outturn.
But essentially, if there was an or an amount of money less than 50,000, so for example, perhaps a planning enforcement officer, that role being moved into a different portfolio to look at enforcement in a different manner, for example, that could be happening and we wouldn't necessarily be able to track it at this stage, especially ahead of the planning review. So, okay. I think there's two indications over there. Councillor English first.
Personally, may I endorse, at least from the housekeeping and financial point of view, the remarks that Councillor de Wigenden has made. We saw a potential planning application in Union Street come before for discussion with ward members recently, and it was quite clear that the officers, certain officers of the council, were pushing something which may or may not have been right in planning terms, but no consideration had been taken elsewhere in the council as to the disastrous effects this would have had on the council's income stream. And I do think sometimes as a local authority, when it's our own scheme that's being brought forward, that we should be considering, all aspects of these things rather than we don't necessarily think about some of these things in the way we should do, actually. And if money is tight, and we need to consider the financial implications of things we do when we take good performing services which produce a revenue for this authority out of action for whatever advantageous projects we have which produce a capital receipt for this council but lose us long-term income. It's short-sighted. And we have done that many times, and parking always seems to be the target. Well, we can build on that car park, and we can get an income for it, and but we're going to lose the revenue. Whereas elsewhere in the council, we're saying, what can we build and to get a revenue income? And it does seem perverse that we're going in one direction, and in one area of the council, in a completely different area, direction elsewhere in the council. So I've endorsed what Councillor de Wigenden said there, and your own well-known reservations on the wisdom of some of our policies in that respect are on the record many times over, Mr. Chairman. So I do think we need to be a little more savvy about what we're doing. And in terms of what you said about the general thing, yes, general financial situation, yes. The parking revenue and other aspect services have long propped up the development control function and policy functions, and that will probably continue. But we shouldn't fool ourselves that because the two things balance out, that we've miraculously managed to handle planning, development control, enforcement and policy in a miraculously brilliant way financially. It's just that they've been cross-subsidised to a large extent by other services within this committee's portfolio. And we should not fool ourselves into some rosy-tinted vision of sunlit uplands. This isn't the general election.
Councillor Willis.
Question for Mr Green on fees. The 120k that was mentioned in the budget. What is the name of the bill? So it's a very, first of all, silly question, but it'll help. What's the name of the bill that hasn't gone through that affects that?
A housing white paper.
Okay. Obviously, that's quite a major problem to us because we budgeted for that. Could we write to that department and ask for clarification of what the timetable, revised timetable for that bill is? And also point out that we're losing out in our budget massively because I'm sure there are other councils that have done the same thing. And and also make the point, the third point, we may not win this, and ask what is going to happen about that lost revenue that we projected. The third part may be contentious, but the first two.
I think the third part's perhaps the most important part, but Mr Green, answer which bits of that you may.
We obviously need to wait for the Queen's speech to see what's coming forward. Mr Jarman has pointed out we should have some reassurance from the fact that Gavin Barwell, who was the Housing Minister, who was behind that proposal, is now in an influential position at the centre of government, so that may be helpful. Can I just come back on the point raised about parking income, which councillors have raised? Clearly, parking income is vital for the council, and looking at the financial position as a whole, we certainly don't want to jeopardise that. It is important for us, and so whenever we're looking at developments at Union Street, for example, we will factor in to our projections for whatever developments take place there any loss of parking income. It's absolutely essential that we do that because clearly we can't just throw away that parking income that we're getting at the moment. So I would like to reassure members that we would take that into account, and we're not going to willingly give up that parking income that, as you said, has been so important for us.
I think Mr Cornell wants to add to that.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think it's also worth pointing out that in terms of the Union Street car park, it is in our emerging local plan as a residential site, and the council's taken a previous decision to buy adjoining land beside it as well to bring forward, redevelopment of that area. So, the die cast to some degree, but obviously the income that is there at the moment is being protected by resiting the spaces to the perimeter of the site in the plan. So all those concerns are being addressed.
Okay, I think it's worth also just reminding ourselves that, whilst we recognise some sites being in the draft local plan, we have not necessarily made the decision to declare them surplus from their current usage. So there is due process, and I'm delighted that Councillor English appears to be coming around to my way of thinking a little more, having had some discussion across this very room in connection with one car park in your ward. Are you indicating to speak, Councillor Cox? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It is relating to car parking and the income. I did make a comment about the amount of permits that we're issuing, and I wonder whether you had any news about that, because if the income that we're seeing here and going backwards, only recently have we had an influx of permits being issued, particularly in my ward, in East Ward, on Sittingbourne Road and around Vinters Lane and around there. I just wonder how you see that, your future assessment of that, because I believe there may be quite a lot of staff permits.
I'll have to come back to you with the details about what our projections for 17-18 are on permits. I'm not aware of the answer to your question at the moment.
Councillor Willis.
Can I just go back to my question to answer it? Is there any merit in writing to that government department to ask for clarification? Because £120,000 from something that doesn't actually tax our local residents, it actually taxes businesses that are wanting to develop, and they've been able to, there's been a lot of development applications. Will it be worthwhile writing that letter to ask for clarification, and also ask, I don't know if anyone agrees with this, also ask the fact that we're losing out because of it, whether there's any plan for compensation?
Can I suggest we wait and see what the Queen's speech reveals, and then perhaps consider that finer point post that?
Can we note then if it's not in the Queen's speech?
Can we rely upon you to bring it forward as a matter?
Can it be noted?
It will be noted in the minutes, but it's not going on to the work programme as such. Right. But if once we see the Queen's speech we have concerns, I'm sure officers will be bringing those to our attention by report anyway. Because before we move on, I mean, when you scan down these columns, I always tend to pick the big numbers first. And one of the big numbers is the income from applications. If I'm looking at the right line, let me just double check this. Yeah, it's a minus 56 number. And that is the conclusion of last year, in effect. And if that trend of applications reducing is continued into this year, and we're missing the 20% uplift to date on everything that we'd hope to be seeing it on, I think the phrase is there may be trouble ahead. So I would be asking that officers do update us at the earliest opportunity on current year projections before we go a lot further.
Certainly happy to update members, and Councillor Burton, I agree it's an area which is volatile, and we need to watch the trends and make sure that if it looks as though there's a downturn, we've got contingency plans to deal with it.
I think we're just asked to note the report for this evening. Is that noted, members? Thank you. Agenda item 17. Ms Collier, thank you for your patience, but may I ask you to introduce the update on the strategic plan performance?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Evening, members. This is the strategic plan performance update for Q4 2016-17. The key performance indicators monitor the delivery of the Council's corporate priorities as set out in the strategic plan. The committee monitored 4 indicators last year, and 3 of those 4 indicators were targeted, and I am pleased to say for Q4, all 3 were green, and whilst one had a negative direction of travel for that quarter, overall all 3 indicators met their target for the year. Now, of the indicators shown in this report, 2 are not going to be reported to the committee next or for this year, 2017-18. As you may remember, we brought a report setting out some recommended indicators from officers, and committee selected 5 indicators they wanted to monitor. If you want to know the 2 that aren't going to be reported, they are on page 79 and 82. And that's the numbers of households housed through the housing register, which will be reported to G Committee, and the number of school journeys undertaken without a car as part of borough-wide schemes, which wasn't a targeted indicator. It was provided to Committee for context. The first quarter report will be coming in August this year, and I'm happy to take any questions on the indicators for quarter 4.
Members, any questions? Yeah, I think I would concur with that, Councillor English. It is very clear and set out before us. If there are no questions, we're asked to note the summary. Is that agreed to note the summary? We are asked to identify if there's any actions that need to be taken by way of amendment. I think we agree that there are none at this time that we would like to highlight. Is that agreed? And finally, we note the progress. Is that agreed? That concludes that item. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Now, we've been going for a little over an hour and 3/4. We've got 2 reasonably solid items to go. Would members like to take a comfort break at this moment for 5 minutes, or would you want to just plough on? I really don't mind. Okay, members, we'll try and keep it to 5 minutes, but let's just pause for stretch our legs and then return promptly. Thank you.